potential area of promise was the Equal Rights Amendment. There was basically a movement by Kirsten Gillibrand in the Senate to get Biden to pressure the archivist to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And there was basically some talk as, is that going to, protect women's rights or ensure access to reproductive rights under a hostile administration to especially reproductive rights? So that's why I asked Beth to come at the last minute today. Beth Persky is also a Women's Leadership Challenge alum and an international lawyer. So part of our session today is going to be the Equal Rights Amendment and having a discussion around that. And the other part of the session is just going to be a chance to do some live coaching. So that's what I call AMA, Ask Me Anything. Whatever it is, some of you last night were asking questions around boundary setting, around mentorship, around you can ask questions if you're curious about the Women's Leadership Challenge, but have unanswered questions. Feel free to ask questions around that. I know Patty is already in our next cohort. Leslie's an alum. So I think it would just be Beth, Marina, and Katie, who actually have not done the challenge in the next cohort. Either questions about the WLC or just a chance to ask me any sort of coaching questions, career questions, etc. So that's the makeup of today's class. So let's get rolling. As you know already, since you all have been here already, the Women's Leadership Challenge is closing applications January 31st. I think I have time. Marina, I don't know if I have time with you. Katie, I know I have time with you set up, but Beth and Marina, I'd love to chat with you all one-on-one, just to hear more about you guys, even if it's not a fit for the Women's Leadership Challenge. I just like to get to know you further since you've been here regularly, and it would be nice to get to know you a little bit further. So I'll put my calendar in the chat. And this is the DC Women's Leadership Challenge. It's fun to do stuff in person sometimes. And we can do what I was doing in January or in December that I decided to offer you all too is a complimentary leadership audit. So that's basically where we do an hour session. You do a couple assessments beforehand, and we go through your strengths, some of your areas of opportunities of growth, and your what's called your saboteurs, or some areas of that might be sabotaging you or holding you back, to be able to have a roadmap going forward for 2025 for your future as a feminist leader. So that's what we could do in our call together as well. So I'll put my Calendly in the chat if you have not booked time yet. And as I mentioned, I am taking a percentage off of the course for women who enroll and pay in full during the Women's Leadership Challenge, or during the Feminist Leadership Formula. Too many feminist challenges and formulas. All right, you all have already heard my spiel. Okay, so the ERA, as I mentioned, actually, Beth, why don't I let you jump right in and give a brief description of the Equal Rights Amendment?
So first, what is the ERA? It's a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution that no one can be denied equal rights under the law on the basis of sex. Section 1 says that the United States and all states cannot deny equal rights based on sex. Section 2 gives Congress the power to enforce the ERA through legislation, and Section 3 says the ERA takes effect 2 years after it's ratified. It was first written by suffragist Alice Paul in 1921. It's been introduced to Congress every year since 1923, but it wasn't ratified by the required number of states by the 1982 deadline. Now, the question came up about the effect of Biden's statement that the ERA is ratified and should be published. So it's up to the National Archives to administer the ratification process. The authority to amend the Constitution is derived from Article 5 of the Constitution. Congress proposes an amendment. The Archivist of the United States administers it. So first, the Constitution says an amendment can be proposed either by Congress with a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and Senate, or by a constitutional convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. None of the 27 amendments to the Constitution have been proposed by constitutional convention. So Congress proposes an amendment in the form of a joint resolution. The president does not have a constitutional role in the amendment process. And the joint resolution doesn't go to the White House for signature or approval. The document, it was in 1972, the ERA was passed by the House and Senate and sent to the states. Let's see, on March 22nd, 1972, the ERA was placed before the state legislatures with a 7-year deadline to acquire ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. A majority of states ratified the proposed constitutional amendment within a year. In 1972, a total of 22 state legislatures ratified it, 8 more in 73, and between 74 and 77, only 5 states approved the ERA, and the deadline of March 22nd, 1979 was approaching. Then several states rescinded their ratification. So the rescinded ratifications were by Nebraska in 1973, Tennessee in 74, Idaho in 77, Kentucky in 78, South Dakota in 79, and North Dakota in 2021. Now, what's interesting is Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually said that they should start over. And what has happened is there's been a lot of legal dispute about the validity of the deadline, the question of whether the deadline has lapsed and whether the ratifications have invalidated it.
Wait, so Beth was RBG saying we should restart the ratification process all over again
Well,
with all the states?
I actually had her language here that I had, let's see, where I quoted her language. Let me see where I have. Okay, I did find her language here. Let me just try to find it. It's basically saying, if some states have ratified it, but others have rescinded it. So what's the legal validity? Yeah, Ginsburg, okay. So Ginsburg voiced her opinion that the best course of action on the ERA is to start over due to being past its expiration date. In February 2020, she said the challenge that if you count a latecomer on the plus side, how can you disregard states that have said they've changed their minds? Now, from what I'm reading, the Constitution is silent on the revocation validity, but it's something that would need to be litigated by the courts. So basically, the archivist has been advised by the Office of the Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice that these are issues that would need to be resolved by the courts. So I think if the archivist were to publish it, going against the advice of the Office of Legal Counsel, there'd be litigation anyway.
So Beth, could you just explain kind of clearly? So Biden made a recommendation to the archivist to publish it, but
yeah, I mean, once it's ratified by 2/3 of the states, and Virginia was the last to ratify it, I think relatively recently. What was it, 2021? Virginia 2020. But there were a couple of legal issues. One is the expiration of the deadline, which Congress does have the power to extend, but there's also the issue of whether the revocations of ratification are valid, and that is an issue that it's silent in the Constitution, and there has been litigation about it introduced. So it would need to be resolved by the courts.
Leslie, do you have a question?
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I don't have on my camera today, but I'm actually using my phone. That's yeah, just a quick because if you said it's not clear, okay, I understand usually that's for a law to become a bill to become a law, two-thirds. I guess it's of the House and the Senate.
No, no, it's so first it had to be approved by the House and Senate, which happened in 1972. But in the case of an amendment, it has to be forwarded to the states, and two
Okay,
thirds
that's
of
what I,
state
oh,
legislatures have to ratify it.
right. Okay. So can it be like there are certain laws where in one state, for example, abortion is legal, and in this state, abortion is not legal? Can it
Well,
is it something like that? So in
yeah,
this
it's
state, okay, the
yeah.
ERA is legal and this one it's not? Or
Well, it's an
that's
amendment to
what
the
it's not.
Constitution, which has national effect. So it's not a
Right, that's
state
what I
law. It's
figure.
not a state law.
Right, that's what I figure. So I'm not understanding then why the states, okay, yeah, the Senate and the House
The
ratify.
states have to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. We have
Oh,
a
I see.
we have
Oh,
a
it's amendment.
federal.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution to guarantee equality on the basis of sex.
Okay, I get it. So then it has to be two-thirds of the state.
Correct. To
Okay,
ratify.
now that's clear. Thank you very
Basically,
much.
Yeah.
what happened is two-thirds of the states have ratified it, but originally it was set to say they had to ratify it by a certain deadline. So the argument has been that they didn't ratify it by a certain deadline. And then what Beth was and I were talking about today is that five states, was it five states or six?
Actually, the last thing I was reading from Wikipedia, there were, let's see how many have rescinded. Six now. North Dakota in 2021.
So a bunch of states also rescinded their
Yeah.
support for the ERA. So they
Oh,
had the popular
oh,
support. And then, something too that I think is really interesting about the ERA is that it looked like it was really going to be passed. And then there's this woman, Phyllis Schlafly, and
Yeah.
a great mini series about her called Mrs. America. And she basically activated against the ERA. And one of the reasons she was successful was because she joined forces with the anti-abortion people, and saw that they had a lot of support, and the evangelical movement. And, that, but the irony of Phyllis Schlafly is like, if you look at her, she was really, she was she had a lot of things that um, a lot of women didn't have in the 70s that you could almost say were feminist, but she wasn't a feminist, if
Well,
that.
she had advanced degrees, but I was telling Samantha that I also do some acting, and I developed Phyllis Schlafly as a character for an acting exercise. So I researched her background, and she came of age in the Midwest in the mid 20th century, and her values were shaped by her upbringing. Um, she was married to a successful man and had several children with him. And you know what it was? I think what they succeeded on was, what was it? Stop taking our privilege, I think is what they said, because the privileged middle class women at that time kind of had it all. Somebody like Phyllis Schlafly could have a career, but she could still live in luxury and be supported by her husband. And actually, ironically, Samantha, something I have to say, I knew a couple of professional women in California who actually were required to pay alimony to their husbands because they earned more than them.
Hmm.
So
So
that type of situation where women actually bear the brunt economically was not something that women like Phyllis Schlafly wanted.
interesting. And during that time, they were kind of saying, like, you're gonna put women in the draft, you're putting women in harm's way. It was very much like pulling women out of the natural state. Um, Beth, so as somebody with legal, expertise, and Beth, when she was in the Women's Leadership Challenge, we haven't really mentioned this, but at the end of the Women's Leadership Challenge, everyone does what's called a feminist change initiative. So that's where you pick an issue that's important to you. Some people decide to just do their own life and their future and really dive into that. But a lot of people pick social issues, be it reproductive rights or pregnancy loss or um, uh, housing for single moms in Chicago, all sorts of different social issues. And Beth chose the ERA, and I kind of provide a framework to do a gender analysis around it and a sort of to apply some of the things that we learn in class to a social issue of, if you were going to ameliorate this issue, what would you do? And also to provide the rest of the cohort some education on that particular topic. And for some women, it's kind of a kick in the butt to, finally do I was so proud of this latest alum, or this latest cohort. A woman came into my cohort. She is a refugee. She grew up in a refugee camp till she was 7 in Laos. And she wanted to create a platform for women refugees to sell their stuff in the US. She's now works in tech in New York, and took all year of coaching, but finally she presented her Feminist Change Initiative. She has a whole business plan, and she's going to launch it, this platform for women refugees to be able to sell their stuff in the US. So like an e-commerce platform for women refugees. Anyway, I digress, but Beth's Feminist Change Initiative was on the ERA. So that's part of why I brought Beth in. So I wonder, Beth, like what's, considering the Trump administration is taking over, what is does whatever Biden did have any gravitas? Like, does it mean?
I mean, I don't think Biden saying that the ERA is ratified really has any power. But what's interesting, something I mentioned to Samantha today, is I'm interested not just in the ERA, which is domestic law, but also the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And there's a group working for U.S. ratification for that. But what they're doing, very interestingly, it's a group called Cities for CETA. They have actually enacted resolutions in a number of different jurisdictions in favor of the UN Women's Convention, which is, basically if a country ratifies CETA, then they're required to have implementing legislation. So the ERA basically would be implementing legislation. But, I looked at the list. So there are a number of cities with ordinances, including Berkeley, Broward County, Florida, LA County, San Diego County, San Francisco, San Jose, Santa Clara County, Miami-Dade County, Honolulu, Kansas City, Cincinnati.
So what is Beth, what is the
Well,
resolution?
they all have different language, and I haven't pulled up the language of all the resolutions. But basically, it's going to be a U.S. version of what CEDAW says. So CEDAW I have here, and actually there's I have another list. There are other cities that have enacted resolutions that including Alameda County, Contra Costa County, Daly City, California, Guadalupe City, Irvine, Laguna Woods, California, Long Beach, Oakland, Palo Alto, Pasadena, Pittsburgh, California, Richmond, California, a whole bunch of places in California, but also Boulder City, Boulder County, Colorado, Erie, Greeley, Colorado, Jamestown, Lafayette City, Louisville, Colorado, Sarasota, Florida, St. Petersburg, Tampa, Maui.
So Beth, but what is the significance?
Okay, so what does CEDAW say? Okay, so CEDAW is a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Article 1 says, for purposes of the present convention, the term discrimination against women shall mean any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. And then there are numerous clauses after that, numerous parts and clauses, as there are in most UN treaties. But basically doing it on an international level, what the ERA would do domestically. So these jurisdictions have enacted local ordinances, and the group decided if they can't get the women's rights ratified nationally, they're going to start on a local level and build out. So that's one way to do it. Take things to your local city council, get them to enact an ERA, not ERA, CEDAW ordinance, and then maybe try to get it to the state level and then build out from there.
And so just to clarify, so it's called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
Yeah.
It was 1979, I believe.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's a UN treaty, and I believe it was 1979.
and we're one of only 6 countries and the only advanced industrialized democracy that has not ratified CEDAW.
Yeah.
So the city's campaign is encouraging U.S. municipalities to become CEDAW cities by incorporating the principles of the convention, like the elimination of sex-based discrimination, promotion of equality, into the municipal code. Some of the things it requires is that they conduct a gender analysis of city operations and laws, establish a convention oversight body, and financially underwrite any convention initiatives. So, I think, this is, as we think about Trump taking office and the next 4 years, I think and this really leads to the next concept that I wanted to talk about tonight before we get into the Ask Me Anything thing, which is locus of control. Is that I think that a lot more states and cities are going to be saying, what can we do? What can we do? What can we control? Right? So, what do we have the jurisdiction to do within our city or within our state that we do not need federal approval for, that we can implement on our own without having to bring in the federal government? That, and it's not to say that some of these things may or may not be challenged in court, but I think especially in blue states, we're going to see a lot more legislation to, for example, if we're thinking about DACA and mass deportations, a lot more legislation around protecting immigrants or protecting immigrants in schools, protecting undocumented workers, limiting the ability of CBP to come into schools, public places, etc. Making sure that there's access to reproductive rights, not just for people within state, but people coming into that state to be able to get reproductive rights. So I think what we're going to see is a lot more amplification in the kind of liberal cities and the blue states of women's rights, undocumented workers' rights, etc., to basically try to balance what's going to happen on the federal government side, which is obviously going to be the abrogation of the rights of women, minorities, LGBTQ, undocumented workers, DACA, etc. So that's what I think is going to happen. Beth, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that happened during the last administration. And I think this is when I started following cities for CETA, I think during the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
I think it was around that time.
So just to go briefly into this concept, and then Beth, I'm going to come back to you for a second. But just because I was thinking about day one and somebody in the chat, and I didn't answer her at the time because I had lots of stuff to talk about and I felt bad. I think it was Carmen, and she said, how do we not get depressed in these next 4 years and feel hopeless or feel defeated? And this is a leadership concept that I really, really like. And it's really understanding like what is really not worth you worrying about. It is, you are not going to influence the trajectory of it. And how do you kind of take that out of your wheelhouse, right? So one example would be the weather. Okay. You're not going to influence the weather. So you can moan and complain about the weather, but you're not going to influence whether there's a polar vortex today or not, right? So there's not that much use to sit and worry and complain about it. Another thing might be, I mean, this depends where you are, right? But you might not be able to influence the Israel hostage crisis or Gaza or something that's very much apart from us. I won't say completely, because we still do have Start Where You Stand and Greta Thunberg, starting this climate revolution, right? But when you think about creating influence, you start in that green space. What can you control? And we can control so many things in our everyday life, especially in America, right? Marina is, I believe, Ukrainian, but we're all from democracies. And within democracies, Leslie's Jamaican, we have a lot of autonomy. So we start with the things that we can control, and then we think about, okay, now that we can control these things, what can we influence? And that's when we get into things like in the Women's Leadership Challenge, and when I do leadership training, things like stakeholder mapping, a power analysis, navigating the system and trying to understand all the different layers of a bureaucracy or an organization, figuring out like where are the connections, where is the hidden power, where's the direct power, who do you need to speak in the ear of? Like we talked about the change champions and the power analysis of like, high power alignment with your issues, et cetera. And that yellow space is really critical, I think, in the next 4 years, thinking about what can you influence? And the other day I popped in the chat 198 methods of nonviolent action. And I just kept thinking about it yesterday with the march in DC, of people marching, which again, I think it's great to march, but like we said, it's not strategic action. And in 198 methods of nonviolent action, there's so many things that can be done on the local level, from artistic displays to music to letter writing campaigns, to I'm trying to think of some other things offhand, to social media. I mean, there's a million different ways of creating movements that are not related to just marching in the street, and there's ways that you can actually go about creating change. So I want you to kind of hold this in your heart when you start to feel in those moments of feeling hopeless, and think, okay, well, what can I control now? What can I influence, right? And then the things that you really can't control, it's important, I think, to be aware of what's going on, but also not to get consumed by it. Like my mom said, I'm watch MSNBC every day. I can't watch this anymore. It's all day, every day. It's like, that's not helpful either, right? It's to sit and watch the news all day, every day, because it's sensationalism. And they say in news, if it bleeds, it leads, right? It's always like the most awful things that you see, and it can become destructive to you. So on that note, that's, and any questions on that conceptual framework, the locus of control concept? And this is a really good coaching tool too for leaders that have teams of, when people have anxiety, as I coach a lot of people that have a lot of anxiety, it's like getting them to focus back in. Okay, well, what can you control in this situation? What is within your jurisdiction? Okay, do you have control over that? Great. What's the next layer? Okay, great. What is outside of your jurisdiction that you can't worry about? So in this example with states and liberal cities, they're like, okay, we can sit here and think, oh my God, what was the federal government, Trump, whatever. Or we can say, what can we do on a local level? Oh, we can implement CEDA. We can do a gender analysis of our local government. We can implement all, various forms of, devoting resources to LGBTQ and migrants and women's rights, et cetera. We can put money towards things like there's things that they can do that are not, again, under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So I really like this concept from a coaching perspective, and also just from a feeling less out of control. Not to, keep going with that. So that's kind of it for Beth. Anything else you wanted to say regarding the ERA?
No, I mean, that's basically it. That, there was, what was interesting is when I was following the ERA advocates, I found out that they were purposely getting legislators who proposed the ERA on the record as part of their tactic, which was interesting. That they knew that the efforts were not going to be successful, but that was part of their long-term strategy, which I found interesting. Mm-hmm. So it's a long game and not always a short game. It's been introduced every year since 1923.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Beth. And that's what we kind of talked about in our change class, was realizing that change does not happen overnight, and that it takes a long time and a lot of generations of women to kind of keep. My mom's like, oh my God, how are we still fighting for the ERA? We were doing this in the 70s. Like, what's going on here? This is crazy. But here we are. So And then also, Beth, I also just want to ask you too. I mean, Beth is also an alum of the Women's Leadership Challenge. She's one of, I don't know how many lawyers I have. You might be, maybe I don't, maybe I only have a couple. I'm just curious for you, what was valuable about the Women's Leadership Challenge for you, and why would you recommend it to anyone who's interested in taking the Women's Leadership Challenge?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a way to work with a great group of women who share the common agenda of making the world a better place and making themselves a better place. We had some really interesting projects. We had someone in our cohort who ran for governor, wasn't it? Or she was running
Oh,
for
she
Congress.
ran for Senate. She ran for
Ran
the
for Senate,
Democratic primary for Senate.
for Senate, yeah. So it's a really interesting dynamic group, and I like the readings uh, in terms of the thought process behind feminist advocacy and the different ways of looking at it.
Thank you so much, Beth. And sorry, I just we had a question in the chat that I didn't realize with Patty. She says, in a nutshell, Biden's statement was not part of the process to officially ratify the ERA. And even though he was the boss of the National Archivist and that person should have followed his lead to administer the amendment, it's not going to happen. Is that accurate?
Not really, no, because it didn't have, she didn't feel she had the legal power because the Office of the Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice told her that it was an issue that had to be addressed by the courts. Both the lapse of the deadline and the revocation of revocations by other states, there were just too many issues that were unanswered for it to be able to be published.
Can I jump in with a follow-up then?
Yeah,
Sure.
go
I
ahead.
guess I'm kind of curious because I mean it's not like policy has not been made knowing that it would be challenged in the court. So if Biden's intention was to say, let's push this through and we'll face, legal challenges when they happen, shouldn't that just be sort of something
Well,
that
it could be.
they,
It
they
could be,
do?
except I think I read the archivist statement that she was erring on the side of caution. But I guess I'll go back to her statement.
Yeah, sorry
So
if I missed it.
that's okay. So the archivist, okay, she made a statement. I can read the whole statement. Um, Tuesday, December 17th, 2024, before Biden made his statement that it was ratified, the Archivist of the United States, Dr. Colleen Shogan, and Deputy Archivist William Bosanko released the following statement. As Archivist and Deputy Archivist of the United States, it is our responsibility to uphold the integrity of the constitutional amendment process and ensure that changes to the Constitution are carried out in accordance with the law. At this time, the ERA cannot be certified as part of the Constitution due to established legal, judicial, and procedural decisions. In 2020 and again in 2022, the Office of Legal Counsel of the United States Department of Justice affirmed that the ratification deadline established by Congress for the ERA is valid and enforceable. The OLC concluded that extending or removing the deadline requires new action by Congress or the courts, because we have three branches of government that Congress passes the laws and the courts interpret the laws. The executive enacts the laws. Court decisions at both the district and circuit level have affirmed that the ratification deadlines established by Congress for the ERA are valid. Therefore, the Archivist of the United States cannot legally publish the Equal Rights Amendment. As the leaders of the National Archives, we will abide by these legal precedents and support the constitutional framework in which we operate. The role of the Archivist of the United States is to follow the law as it stands, ensuring the integrity of our nation's governing institutions. Personal opinion or beliefs are not relevant. As the leaders of the National Archives, we support established legal processes and decisions. So they felt that was the right legal interpretation.
Which there was some saying basically that like Gillibrand was saying, like it's not the role of the archivist to push back against Biden, that she should have just actually published it. Yeah, exactly what you're saying, Patty. Like that her role is to actually just enact what the president says. But
well, except that the process, as we've discussed, the president doesn't really play a role in this process. It's between Congress and the states and the courts.
So but it wasn't it that the president could issue an executive order that said,
No, I mean, I don't see how a president could issue an executive order enacting an amendment to the Constitution, because I think we read towards the beginning of this that the president does not play a role in the constitutional amendment process. It's before Congress and then the states.
hmm,
There have been a number of presidents who've endorsed it over the years. Kennedy created a commission.
interesting.
Yeah, it's not a function of the executive branch to ratify a constitutional amendment.
Interesting. Yeah, it is super annoying. And, it's unfortunate because I think it's just so obvious that we need it.
Yeah, we do need it, but I would just say, as a lawyer, yeah, I think that interpretation is right. It needs to be litigated in the courts. The deadline issue and the revocation of ratification issue.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Well, thank you, Beth, so much for speaking. I want to just turn it over to to the Ask Me Anything portion of our session, with the knowledge that this is being recorded. So nothing too private that you're not comfortable sharing publicly. But if there's any questions for me about the Women's Leadership Challenge, about whatever, women coaching, women's rights, I don't care. Like, please feel free to put them in the chat, or just raise your hand and come off mute. I'm happy to answer any questions. And or Beth or Leslie, because they're both alumni of the Women's Leaders Challenge. The biggest adjustments. Katie, when you say adjustments, what do you mean by adjustments?
So as people have gone through this challenge and they've grown and they've changed over the 6, 8, 12 months, however long their challenge has been, is it that you've seen people become more extroverted, much more confident in themselves? Is it that they've gained a new sense of self? Is it that they feel much more empowered? How do you see the changes of the people, right? Because you're exposing them to new stimuli along this way. And of course, due to that, they're going to be changing and adjusting and learning. So what are some of the biggest changes you've seen during their time?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Katie. All of the above. You know, it's amazing. Somebody said the other day what was really valuable for her in the challenge was seeing other women who don't realize how great they are. And then they start to realize how great they are. And then she started to realize how great she was. And then by the end, everyone realized how great each other was. And so this this mutually reinforcing community of women who lifts one another up. And you're also empowered with the tools and the frameworks. Like, we do a lot on confidence building and understanding yourself and understanding what I call it your UVP, your unique value proposition is, and why we spend so much time as young girls comparing ourselves. They say comparison is the thief of joy. And we, even later in life, it's like, oh, that person that makes more money. Oh, that person's prettier. Oh, that person is doing, Forbes under 40 or whatever. And when we start to realize who we are as people and what we have to offer, and then that's reinforced by a lot of women, plus I think the push that everyone and the kick in the butt that people get to actually go after the stuff that they've dreamed about and wanted to do, and then they start to make it actionable and realize that they can actually do it, from women who, it's like the empowerment part starts, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I just created the first draft for my book. Oh, I just got a book agent. Oh, guess what? I just got a publisher. My book's being published next year. And I'm like, whoa, wait, what? We're like, they'll say in the class, like, what would I do if I could not fail? I want to run for office. And then all of a sudden, a year later, I'm seeing their name in the news and they're running for the, Democratic primary for Senate. So I think it's that women just gain a huge sense of self and also become empowered with advocacy tools to be able to create the change in the world that they want to create. And through that understanding of self and also understanding of the broader system. Leslie or Beth, I'm curious your thoughts as alums. What are, do either of you have a thought on that? A perspective?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can be a long process. I mean, I at first I said I was going to work on getting the ERA passed and getting CITO ratified, and I realized there are already a lot of groups doing that. And then the organization, I actually I'm really glad you called me, because I found out that the deadline for registration for the UN Commission on the Status of Women meetings is Friday, and they moved it up this year. And I had to quickly do my application. But the thing is, I can go to these meetings, but I, as an individual, have little power. So I think part of it is also learning that you need to work with other people who are involved in these issues.
Leslie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for me, I think just what you said. I mean, I didn't go and run for the Senate, but I mean, on a smaller scale, first of all, as Beth said, you have this group of inspiring, dynamic women. And, they're really pushing you. They're pushing you. They're, your best cheerleaders. No, you should do it. And I remember I was kind of shocked because I don't, I must have had some goal in the beginning of the class. And then I got accepted to do this capacity development thing with GW, like a certificate class, just like a adult learning, continuing education type of thing. And I remember Samantha said, "Oh, Leslie, you met your goal." I'm like, "Oh, whoops, I had a goal." And so, you have this sort of your own cheerleader, and, that's what, we need. You need the group of women, the out there. Sometimes the world is not to be gloom and doom, but sometimes you don't have advocates in your corner. That's kind of rare. And me, just in my work life, really didn't have many, unfortunately didn't have any mentors. So the one thing and I remember I kept saying, well, I'm going to change that. I'm going to mentor, especially young women. And what this class allowed me to do. So I said, yes, I had the will, I wanted to do it, but I'm like, okay, how do you actually mentor somebody? Because I've never been mentored. And this challenge allowed me, the Women's Leadership Challenge provided me with the tools to mentor women in my, whom I work with. So if that's of any help to you.
Katie, is that helpful?
It is. It's always interesting to hear from other people, both from the person running the program, but also from the folks who have gone through the program, what they've gotten out of it and how you've seen other change, right? Because you don't always know when you yourself are changing. And so being able to see both through the lens of the teacher, but also the lens of the people who have been in the group and how you have perceived your own change is quite helpful.
Yeah, I think too, Katie, I mean, I've had some women come in that just have so much self-doubt, and I'm looking at them and saying, you're amazing. Like, why do you have so much self-doubt and imposter syndrome? Why are you not asking for a raise? And like, what, somebody didn't get a raise for 5 years or even ask, or was being, or wasn't going for like their nonprofit. They had kind of started it, but was scared to jump in. I'm like, you're incredible. Like, you're so dynamic. You're so bright. Like, why are you not doing this? And I think, even me, like, I'm in a coaching program. I have a coach that I text all the time and say, I'm not sure about this. Should I say this? Do I do this? For the last 2 years, I've invested in a program that's double the cost of mine and some, because everybody needs that accountability to be able to accomplish things. Because when you're on your own, you don't necessarily have that. And then when you have people that are saying like, look at what you've got, it makes such a difference. And then the other thing too that I've done that's I think helpful is I do coaching at the beginning, and then we go into curriculum, so that if people are having like acute issues, like a personality conflict with someone at work, or somebody, a guy at work put everything that someone had done for 2 years on his resume and promoted himself on LinkedIn. And, how do you deal with that situation? Or somebody was being sidelined and wanted to talk to the head of HR but needed some strategies on how to give that person feedback and how to handle that conversation. And so having that live coaching too, I'm able to kind of, because I'm an executive coach, mix some of that executive coaching in the beginning and then being able to come back to it. And it's really cool seeing, like that particular conversation, that person came back the next session and had that meeting with, it wasn't even the head of HR, it was like the head of this global foundation, and got her point across and got what she wanted and created some level of systems change for other people that were also women of color that were going through what she was going through. And so I think that that's the other thing, is that a lot of the research around learning shows that you learn best when it's in like segments of time that are split up, which is why I don't do just a conference, right? Or a week-long session. It's, every other week for almost a year, because that's what the research shows, because then you have time to apply stuff and come back and report back. And sometimes it's not good news, because sometimes the other thing I've seen happen, Katie, which is interesting and which we need to know as women, is if you are not someone who stepped into their power, or you're not someone who speaks up, or you're not someone who asks for a raise, you're not someone who pushes back, and you start to do that because of this class, you will get pushback sometimes. And sometimes that's part of the process. So when you come back and you say, my boss didn't like that I asked for a raise, or, these people are confused that I'm now saying, hey, I can't take on all of your work, because I'm now starting to set some boundaries and say, hey, I come first. Like, I'm not taking on all your work because it's not part of my job description. And they're reacting. So it's also, that's actually another really big thing in the course that I've seen a lot of women do, is a lot of women they take on so much that is like everybody else's dirty laundry all the time. And I've had women that don't even know what brings them joy. And it's like, how, like, what brings you joy? And that's so important in life. And they just become everyone's mom. And I think that's beautiful in some ways, but setting boundaries is also a huge thing for women in the class, like learning to say no, learning to, and I've done this myself in my career, where I, sucked up and took on a bunch of work that was somebody else's, and he was getting paid more than me, and then he didn't even do his bare minimum. And I said, what am I doing here? This is crazy. So I think setting boundaries is also huge, and learning to say no, and figure out what the priorities are. What do you actually want? And then Beth, I think that part is important too, right? Transitions. Like there's a lot of women who have come in a moment of transition, of saying, I've been doing X for 20 years. I've been working for the IMF for 15 years. And I don't want to work for the IMF anymore, but I don't know what I want to do. I might want to start my own business. I might want to go start a nonprofit. I might want to write a book. I might want to do some consulting. I might want to go work for this other global foundation. I might want to be a diplomat. I don't know. So it gives them that exposure to other women that are doing all sorts of different stuff. I've had women that are in consulting for 15 years. And I did that intentionally, because one of the things I saw with women's groups is they were all siloed by industry. So it's like women in tech, women in finance, women in blah, blah, blah. But what happens when you want to get out of finance, or you want to get out of tech, or you want to get out of impact, or you want to get out of whatever? You don't have that community because everybody's in that silo, or women in government, right? And so I wanted to create cohorts that were cross sector. And I also wanted to see women help each other, right? Women that have more resources financially to be able to, it was really cool. There was like two women who were both engineers, and one was from the Netherlands, one was from Maine, and they both hosted a fundraiser together for another woman in their cohort who runs an NGO working with Indigenous communities to advocate for community-driven health solutions. And they held a nonprofit fundraiser for her. And women with nonprofits typically are, always kind of trying to get resources. And that was I wanted to see women from the private sector be able to help women that are in the public sector, and then women from the public sector give so much insight to women in the private sector from the social impact perspective. So that's another piece of this, is that kind of cross-sector learning and transitioning into what you want to do next, and being really intentional about it, and not just letting life kind of take you, but really being intentional about what you want and what you're good at and what you're best suited for, so that you can live your most fulfilled, happiest life, making the biggest impact that you can possibly make. And that's my goal, is to, empower women who can have a ripple effect on other women, not just to, I always say I don't just teach 8 women at a time. I teach women who I know are going to have a ripple effect on the rest of the world. And I'm privileged to as you've seen in the speakers in the cohorts or in the classes, to have those type of women. So it's a long-winded answer. There's over 100 women now. So there's so many things that I can't even like explain all of them, because I think I've told you, people leaving toxic marriages, that was not my expectation, or toxic relationships. That was not that's not in the brochure for the Women's Leadership Challenge, but that also happened, which was interesting, because when women take their power, they realize what they deserve, whether it's financial, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in a friendship, whether it's in their family. They now, yeah, they're different. All right. So anyway, I know it's kind of funny. Any other like questions or coaching questions? All right. Well, we have one session left, which is tomorrow, claim your seat at the table. And that's so Dominique is another WLC alum. I'm so privileged to have all these amazing alums. Dom is like a force of energy. I can't even explain her. She has so much energy. She puts me to shame. Like I literally feel like I just see her and I'm like, I just want to do like jumping jacks and have a party. She's super, super awesome. She wrote a book called Live Your New Story. She's also like the wife of a foreign service officer. She's like raised 2 little girls in Australia. One of her things in the Women's Leadership Challenge was to create an organization for women expats. She's awesome. She helped me out. She was like my TA for one cohort. So she's going to be joining us tomorrow for our last and final class. And if my calendar link doesn't work, please let me know. And I look forward to seeing some of you one-on-one and having those one-on-one convos. So let's finish like we usually do with one insight that you're leaving with today. And you can put it in the chat or just come off mute. One insight you're leaving with today. Cool, ERA. Yeah, it's so confusing. That's just why I wanted Beth to come. Yeah, everyone needs accountability. Coaches need the coaches. Need the coaches. Surprise. All right. Well, thank you, ladies. It's good to see everyone. And, thank you for, Beth, Katie, Marina for being the regular attendees. It's been great having you. And I started to feel sad. I was like, I really hope they end up in the challenge, because I'm getting used to seeing them all the time. All right. On that note, and I also just want to thank Beth so much for joining us and for explaining the Equal Rights Amendment to us and what exactly the status is, and what's going on moving forward. So thank you for that, Beth.
You're welcome.
All right. Good night, everybody. See y'all tomorrow.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Beth.